Thank you, Eric, so much for being here. We're really excited to have you be a part of our event and Breaking Barriers and this really critically important conversation that we're having on what will it take to create equity for children, families, and communities here in Illinois, but really across the country. And we're so excited to have you. We've had a long-standing relationship and partnership with BMO Harris Bank for more than 40 years. Your Chief Risk Officer, Anne Marie Wright, sits on our board of directors and has been a part of our organization for many years and oversees our program and policy committee, and really under her leadership helping to push us to do better every single day. I want to kind of just jump right in and ask you to introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to the here and now.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Tara, for having me. It's an honor to join, and thanks to the wonderful team here at Children's Home and Aid. I am a vice chairman at BMO Harris. I'm relatively new to my role. I joined the bank last January, right before the pandemic. Who knew that the world would turn upside down? But it has been a unique opportunity for me to join a terrific leadership team and to really begin to help us think about ways that we can deepen the impact of the work that we do, particularly at a time when inclusive economic recovery is so important. The needs are great, and that means that we have to be that much more intentional and purpose-driven around how we think about our role as a financial institution and what that means in terms of shaping economic policy and economic growth. So I also recognize that it means that there's an important role for public-private partnership, which is why I'm particularly pleased of the long-standing partnership that we've had with Children's Home and Aid, and look forward to making sure that we can continue to make that relationship grow.
You started in your position in January 2020.
Yes.
I mean, how the world incredibly changed on us from that moment over the past 16 months, whether it was the pandemic that completely disproportionately devastated our Black and brown communities, followed by the racial reckoning that tore through this country's conscience and through our neighborhoods, and then the increasingly significant wealth gap that is being experienced all over the country. And then you add to that the political environment
Yes.
that we are living through that is only tearing us apart, honestly, even more. So when you took the role in January, could you have ever imagined all of that unfolding? I'm sure the answer is no, but I think more importantly, how has it changed kind of your thought process and your approach to the work that you're in charge of at BMO?
I think for all of us, the last year and a half has been an awakening of a number of underlying challenges that have now been unmasked. If we start first with COVID and the disparate impact that we saw, particularly with the Black and brown community, I think it was Janet Yellen that put it best when she said that Blacks were the first to lose their jobs, Black businesses were the first to close, and if we're not intentional based on the trends, Blacks and Latinos will be the last to be rehired. And so when you think about it from that perspective, it gives you, I think, a sense of urgency to recognize that we have to be very intentional on how we address many of the systemic issues that we now face. You touched on the racial wealth gap, and that's something that has always been there, and it's been widening over the years. As we look across our great city of Chicago, clearly we see a tale of two cities, and we see where areas like the South and West Side have been underinvested in. And so when you go back and you look at the history of what's caused that, there are structural barriers and issues around systemic racism that have contributed to that huge divide. But where that ultimately leaves us right now is that a racial wealth gap. Today, if we look at data like from the Brookings Institute, it suggests that the average white family has wealth of about $175,000. versus the average black family, which only has wealth of about maybe $17,000. That stems from disparities that we see in education, which then leads to disparities that we see in terms of job opportunities. It means that kids that are born in a certain zip code have a different chance at success, and the outcomes should not be driven based on the color of your skin or the zip code that you live in. So it has really given me as a banker, and I think many of my colleagues at BMO, a desire to make sure that we're thinking about doing banking in a fundamentally different way, a way that allows us to have a greater impact on the communities that we serve, and making sure that we can tear down some of the barriers that have existed for far too long. And it's been, I think, a year that has been challenging for so many, but yet through it all, we're optimistic about what the future will hold. For the first time now in our nation's history, racial and social equity is now on the agenda for the President of the United States. We're having a discussion around issues related to criminal justice reform. And we look at the tragic killing of George Floyd, and while that was, I think, a pivotal moment, history shows us, going back to Emmett Till all the way through to Trayvon Martin and Eric Garner, that this has been a pattern of what has been going on throughout our society. When we look at Breonna Taylor and the injustice that has really come to the forelight now, we recognize that we have to be focused on how do we address the issues that are dividing us as a nation, as a people, our economy, and banks play an important role as part of that. And so there are many ways that I think we'll be able to focus on how we provide access to capital, how we invest in underserved communities, how we focus on growing businesses and getting our economy back up and going. And so as a banker, I'm really excited about this opportunity because as I look right now at the economic recovery, it's rather unprecedented, almost as unprecedented as the crisis that we went through. And I'm confident that as we move forward, if we're smart, if we're purpose-driven, that we will be able to make transformative changes, not only here in Chicago and in our communities, but across our country. And I'm also optimistic that we will see continued change and progress.
You're a banker, but the reality is you're also part of the corporate sector. And I think that there's been this big shift really over the past 20 years, but even more so in the past recent years around this idea of corporate social responsibility.
Yes.
I think at one point it was, it was some philanthropy, some community engagement, some marketing opportunities. But I think that this idea of what is that responsibility for companies and for financial institutions beyond their products and their services to be a part of that solution, to really think about what does it mean to advance racial and social equity more broadly than just within that corporate company.
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit about kind of BMO's perspective, your own personal perspective on the role that companies should be playing in this space?
I think the way I would answer that question initially is maybe based on a personal sort of philosophy that I have, and it's one that I've kind of grown up with throughout my career, and it's a notion that companies are only as strong as the communities that they serve. And so with that sort of spirit, I reflect on one of the real reasons why I joined BMO, and it was because of the culture that we have as a bank. And our mission is to boldly grow the good in business and life. And we do that through corporate and social responsibility. And we think about it from the standpoint of how do we have a social impact that goes beyond just philanthropy, but also extends to our business practices. It starts with how we welcome a new customer into our branch and cultivate a relationship there, and helping that customer think about ways that they're going to plan for their future, and thinking about saving for college or buying their first home, all the way to how do we help a large company think about an acquisition or finance their working capital needs. You do that in a way that is fair and equitable, and that has not always been the case. And so because there have been structural issues and structural barriers, it means that we have to focus on solutions and approaches that will tear down those barriers. If I were to give you an example, most recently, we saw the federal government move with rapid speed to set up stimulus funding in the form of PPP. The first round, I think we had lots of hard lessons that we learned, but we saw some practices there that were not necessarily fair, where larger companies were getting access to funding before some of the smaller companies that really needed the PPP funding. At BMO, we decided to not necessarily follow the rules. It said that you had to be an existing customer in order to work with that bank to get PPP. We also wanted to make sure that we had direct outreach to Black and brown businesses and women-owned businesses that were clearly being left on the sidelines. And so that's how you think about your corporate and social responsibility, is how do you not only think about it from the standpoint of philanthropy, but how do you think about it in terms of your business practices? And it's during a time of crisis that I think you are able to distinguish yourself from a leadership role and to do really what's right. And that's really what I think corporate responsibility comes down to.
Given the difficult history that many of the largest companies and quite honestly our largest financial institutions have in really helping to create and sustain some of those barriers, some of those disinvestments in Black and brown communities, you know, this movement towards centering racial equity and building an inclusive economy, can it be done authentically? And part of the reason I asked this question is because I was really particularly struck with something that I read on your website about truth and acknowledgement. You know, and I think for Children's Home and Aid as a social service organization who's been around for 140 years, we've been grappling with our own sense of truth and history and really trying to face that head on. And acknowledge it in a way that allows us to move forward and to start to begin to heal, right? And so from a financial institution, I think a lot of us understand kind of the role that a lot of banks played periodically throughout the history. How do you guys do that? How does BMO do that kind of truth and acknowledgement process? What does that look like for you?
I think it's important to acknowledge the disparities, the economic disparities that have occurred. There's been a long history, 400 years of slavery. There's been Jim Crow. There have been immigration issues. We have a lot in our society to be proud of, but I think in order to really be proud, you have to have truth and acknowledgement of some of the things that have occurred that you're not necessarily proud of. Because if you aren't honest about that, then history is likely to repeat itself. And so we have seen economic cycles occur in the past as well. When we went through the 2008 financial crisis, we saw that the economy really disproportionately impacted those that were in poverty. It disproportionately impacted those that were minorities, and we saw unemployment rise significantly. And it took us longer to come out of that. And I think now is the moment for us, as we're focused on economic recovery, to make sure that as a bank, we can be at the forefront of helping to promote inclusive economic recovery. We can do that through our lending practices. By accelerating the pace of lending to small businesses and minority businesses. We can do that by looking at opportunities to invest in underserved communities. And we can do that also by making sure that we're creating zero barriers. And zero barriers really for our clients, our communities, and for our employees. And I think the last point that I'll share as well is from a business standpoint, it means making sure that you've got measurable outcomes for what you're looking to achieve. And as a business leader, we all know that what gets measured gets done. And so we have to make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable. We have to make sure that we're able to demonstrate what we have made commitments toward, not only to our shareholders and to our clients, but to the communities that we serve. And that's how I think you have authenticity, is when you're able to actually have a strategy and you're able to communicate what your vision and your strategy is, but then to show the results of how that's being driven.
How are you guys demonstrating those results? I mean, how are you holding yourself accountable to what are the goals that you're trying to achieve?
Sure. So there are several key initiatives that I'll share that specifically point to our commitment around racial and social equity. In 2019, we announced a new initiative called Zero Barriers. And that was really intended to focus on putting goals in place through 2025 for how we were going to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion from a hiring standpoint. We made certain commitments that we would have representation within our leadership ranks of 30% for people of color, that we would have within that mix roughly 7% of our leadership team would be African American and 7% Latino. It also meant that we were going to have certain commitments around gender equality and making sure that we had between 40 to 60% representation within our leadership ranks. That really makes a meaningful difference, because what I have learned is that when you have diversity in your C-suite and on your board, those decisions that impact our communities the most are really important when you have those voices from representatives from those groups sitting around the table and helping to make those decisions. And so that is something that I think, again, as we think about how we hold ourselves accountable for, it's putting in place a goal and making sure that we're tracking toward that and that we're able to deliver on those key initiatives. And then also making sure that as we think about our standing as a bank, that we're not just solely looking at our returns on shareholder equity and the investments that we're making, but that there are specific returns that we're highlighting around the impact that we're having to our local communities and our clients.
I think that element of the community voice and those most impacted is really incredibly important. And we see it obviously as a nonprofit organization, doing work in Chicago, the families that we work with and we partner with, really trying to center all of our work around them. Sure. and uplift their voices. I'm curious as you're thinking about these zero barriers, how did you kind of create those metrics with making sure that you had all of those voices, that community that you engage with as well?
Yes, I think the first thing that we did was to really have truth and acknowledgement that diversity and equity has been something that has been an issue in financial services for far too long. And having that acknowledgement, I think, was essential. The other thing that was really important was having the commitment from our CEO, Dave Casper, here in the U.S. to make sure that from the top of the house that he made it clear that that was going to be fundamentally important for us as a leading bank. I think it's also clear to say that from a business standpoint, we have to make sure that our team reflects the rich diversity of the communities that we serve. Diversity is something that is, I think, a true treasure of our American culture. And so as a result, the communities that Children Home and Aid serve also reflects the communities that we serve. So that's very important. A couple of the other things that I think really drove us to that as well was recognizing the fact that as we look at Chicago, as we look across our U.S. footprint, as we look to Canada, the need to also have diversity is important for our future, because we have to be able to attract the best and brightest talent, and the only way you can do that is by having a focus on diversity. And it also means that we have to be able to have the types of public-private partnerships that will foster really the types of diversity, equity, and inclusion that is important. So our opportunity to partner, for instance, with Mayor Lori Lightfoot is a key example of something that we've done to try to help promote an inclusive economic recovery. In 2019, the mayor announced our Invest Southwest initiative, and we were proud to step up as the first corporate partner to donate $10 million to that initiative, really to focus on ways that we can invest in communities like Austin, like Lawndale, and to do it in a community-led approach where we're listening to the community to understand what are the needs and what are the opportunities for us to work together in areas like workforce development and education and housing and urban development, so that we can do it with a comprehensive approach to addressing and tackling many of the issues that are essential.
So let's switch gears just for a little bit and focus on the amazing employees that make up BMO Harris Bank. The families served by Children's Home and Aid have really benefited from the corporate philanthropy at BMO. You guys have given generously both of your time, both of your treasure, of your employees, and of your expertise. I mean, you have supported us during the holidays, during back to school, and just again, in general, supporting the organization to continue the work that we do each and every day out in the communities. And I think that you know, that spirit of, it's not just the bank cuts us a check and then we go on our merry way. It's this really deeply ingrained in the people at BMO Harris Bank. And I think that doesn't come accidentally, right? I think that has to come with some level of intentionality. So would love to just hear your perspective on how has BMO found this rich, diverse group of employees to really carry out what you guys are hoping to accomplish?
I really, once again, want to thank you for the partnership because it is important for us to think about those public-private partnerships that will help us to come out of this crisis. And as I think about philanthropy, philanthropy has evolved, at least for us, beyond simply buying a table at a gala or for an event to making sure that you're developing long-term partnerships so that you can invest in the programmatic side of the organization to really make sure that you're, again, investing directly in the communities that need it the most. The work and the service that you're providing in terms of just families here in Chicago, the reputation, the history is so rich. But right now, we see the need being that much greater as we come through an economic crisis, as we come through the crisis around our racial and social equity, as we think about the health disparities that exist. We know that organizations like yours are at the front line of what you do and what you do best. And so we have to make sure that we're able to not only provide the financial capital, but the intellectual capital. So our employees enjoy the opportunity to come out and volunteer and work closely hand in hand with organizations like yours, but to make sure that we can do it in a way that allows us to really give back and to, again, our mission to boldly grow the good.
So when you look into the future and you look out maybe 10 years from now, what do you hope to see as the impact that BMO's investments and efforts around racial and social equity is having? What might look different if I worked at BMO? What might look different in the communities that surround your offices? And I'm going to take it one step further and say, what are you guys willing to do to ensure that vision becomes a reality?
So one of the things that we recognized that has been part of the structural barriers is the access to capital that has been denied to minorities and women. So when I joined the bank, one of the first things that my CEO asked me to do was to think about ways that we could really address that from a business standpoint. So I worked with our leadership team to launch a new initiative called BMO Empower, which is a $5 billion 5-year commitment that we've made to helping to promote inclusive economic recovery. We're doing that by focusing on ways that we can provide additional access to capital as well as direct investment in areas like community redevelopment and neighborhood revitalization, areas like supporting small businesses. We're also doing it by looking at ways that we can use our own purchasing power as a major financial institution to say, how can we promote supplier diversity in a more robust way? So we've put targets in place to say that we want to spend annually $400 million across North America with diverse suppliers as part of our own purchasing power and supply chain. And I think that that's how, again, you get back to an inclusive economic recovery, is by making sure that there's a level playing ground for the large companies, the small companies, the minority companies that will be given a chance to become the large Apple or Facebook. And you do that by making sure that you're lending to them and that you're investing in them. When I think about investing, one of the things that we're doing that's different is that part of BMO Empower is that we launched a social impact fund to invest in private equity and venture capital firms. We made our first investment in a new $100 million fund called Cast Us, which was launched by Don and Liz Thompson, the former CEO from McDonald's. And we recognized that for far too long, too many minority and women-owned businesses have not had access to equity capital in order to grow their businesses. So as a result, we no longer have a large pipeline of Johnson Publishings or Ariel investments coming up through our business. We used to have Soft Sheen and, you name it. Chicago was the headquarters for major black-owned businesses. We recognize that we have to get back to having that sort of pipeline of companies that we're investing in as part of our future. Those businesses are the ones that create job opportunities for the kids here in Chicago. And so we want to make sure that as we think about the strategies, the business practices, the way that we're aligning our business with philanthropy, that we're also thinking about what the outcomes will be. So I think about the future, what that looks like for me is that a kid growing up on the south side of Chicago will have just as much opportunity as a child on the Gold Coast. It will mean that we'll look across our city and our country, and we'll see companies having opportunities to grow and to become, minority-owned and women-owned businesses that are part of the Fortune 500 list. It means that we will have economic equity in terms of closing the racial wealth gap. It means that we'll have job opportunities where people can put in a resume and they will not necessarily care whether your name is John or whether it's Tyrone, but there will be a fair and equal opportunity. It means that when we walk down the street that we don't have to worry about whether or not we're safe in our communities. It means that we'll have a trusting relationship with our local police departments and with our law officials. It means that the left and the right will talk to each other and that we'll find that we have more in common than that separates us or that divides us. And I'm optimistic as we've come through so many challenges throughout our history. We've always been resilient and we've always come through it and we've come out better and stronger. And I'm certain that as we come through this crisis that we will do just the same.
I think that's an amazing vision, and it's one that I definitely share. And I wonder if I can ask you one final personal question. What do you think it's going to take to achieve that? I think the investment that BMO is making and is amazing. It is absolutely outstanding for our community, and I think Chicago is going to be incredibly better off for your leadership here. And I'm very aware that not any single entity, not you guys, not Children's Home and Aid, can accomplish this on our own. So, if you were to say to our audience, it's the premise of this whole event, what's it going to take to truly create and have that vision that you just beautifully laid out?
I think what it really will require is a sense of unity and coming together. And I think you are able to foster that through leadership. Leadership in Washington, leadership in Springfield and here in City Hall, but also leadership in terms of the public-private partnerships. And so the opportunity for BMO to partner with Children's Home and Aid and the leadership that you're providing in the community, serving those needs that are so critical to families and communities is really what is most important. And I think that sense of unity will also inspire a sense of optimism for the future. We have to get back to being proud of who we are as a people and recognizing that our future lies with our children, and making the investment in children's and families is the most important treasure that I see. As a bank, we always think about our assets, and I think our biggest assets right now are the bright futures of our kids, and we have to make sure that we're investing in their future.
Eric, I want to thank you. I think this was absolutely amazing. We could not agree more. Our biggest asset across all of our communities are the children and families that reside in our neighborhoods just outside the window here. So thank you so much for being a part of today's conversation and for all the work that you're doing here in Illinois and quite frankly across the country.
Thank you.
Thank you.